Thanks for being here. It's great to have Chris and Supply Frame hosting this. I see a lot of familiar faces, which is always good. Real quickly, Avdan and I are both 50% each of Root Ventures. A little bit about us: we're a San Francisco-based seed stage, hardware-focused venture capital fund. And so this is our current portfolio. The ones that are relevant to this crowd that stand out are probably Particle, which I saw a few people hacking on earlier, and Shaper Tools if some of you are into the more mechanical things. The rest of the portfolio skews more towards enterprise and industrial hardware and hardware management systems. If you're interested in this part of the business, come find me after. What I want to talk about today is a bit more about, as you're thinking about either your own projects or hardware companies, how to think through financing, and more importantly, how to think through your initial production runs. And so the reality is, VC, for all of our TechCrunch articles and Medium posts about changing the world, we're just a small, weird, high beta asset class of private equity. Like, fundamentally, that's what we are. And what that means is that VCs have a very specific niche of investments that they can do or will do. And what that means for you guys is, because hardware is very different than software in a lot of ways, one of which it's easier to generate revenue with small hardware projects, it often means that the VC investment is not necessarily the right fit, right? And a lot of times, Avdan has a very vulgar word for it. I'm a little more polite than Avdan, so I won't say it here, but VCs will be very excited when talking to you, and then they'll kind of like fall off the map and disappear. And sometimes they won't tell you why, and that's really frustrating. And so I want to tell you a little bit about why the financing model doesn't necessarily work, and what might be the reason that they don't want to invest or you don't want them to invest. The first is primarily governance, right? You're really trading control or partial control of your company when you take venture capital. And I'll give you guys examples. So how many of you guys have like hardware side projects going on right now, right? So at least like a plurality, if not a majority of you all. If those side projects kind of take off and you're like, great, I can quit my full-time job and I work on this, I want to raise some venture capital, and you get that venture capital closed. Let's say we write you a check, it closes today. The very next day, Chris and the awesome folks at Supply Frame come over and say, I love this project. I have $5 million cash in this briefcase right now. You can have half, your co-founder can have half. Come work for us at Supply Frame. We'll have pizza and beer every day, and you'll have access to all the tools you want. That's an awesome deal. There's $2.5 million in your pocket. You get to work on your project in the Supply Frame offices, right? If you have a venture capitalist invested at that point, they will nuke that deal without even reading the terms. And they can do that because you've signed over governance, right? So if you're thinking about your business, like if your dream is to run an awesome product company and you know your audience and you love working every day with them, think about what that governance means for your ability to be highly flexible with who you end up working with in the long term. Management. So going back to this slide, a lot of these company CEOs were not there when the company was founded, right? And the reality is building excellent products and running excellent companies are not necessarily the same thing. And in a lot of cases, really good technical founders are eager to kind of hand over the reins and let a professional manager come in and run the business so they can focus on product. But sometimes that's not necessarily the case. And if you want full control, again, that's similar to governance, if you want full control of your business, that might not necessarily happen if you want to take VC money. And finally, stress, right? Like the lifestyle of running a VC-backed business I'm going to be honest, it's great for the VCs because we're hedging our risk in all your dreams, but you're doubled down on your dream, and it's a really high-stress environment. I actually ran a bicycle company for 3 years before I joined Root Ventures, and like those were probably the most stressful, but the most fun times in my life. And so that's a big thing, and depending on your life situation, it is something worth considering before you kind of start blindly following VC money if that's what you want. And ultimately, economics. Like I said, venture capital is a class of private equity, and when it comes down to brass tacks, the terms that the lawyers put in can be pretty onerous for founders, especially in hardware where the capital is a bit more higher risk than software, right? And so without getting into too much details, liquidation preference basically means that investors can take money off the table before the founders do. And then venture debt, which almost always occurs in hardware because you generally want to pay for hardware with debt and not equity. Whenever a company sells, debt holders always get paid off first, right? This, not to be a Debbie Downer about all this, I know this was not a great set of slides, but if you guys want to start these hardware companies, you want venture investing, I think it's very important for the investors and the founders to be on the same page and understand the risks on both sides of the table. So kind of leaving it at that, any of you thinking about this in more detail with your own company, with your friend's company, please come find me after, and I would love to talk in detail about how we could help you or find people to help you with all of this. And finally, one last slide about the boring part of the business. Why do we act this way, and why do we have all these strange onerous terms? So a bunch of toy numbers, which are approximately correct, to kind of simulate, let's call it the supply frame venture fund, right? So if supply frame is running a $100 million venture fund, which is usually funded by large endowments or funds or asset managers that have to place their money somewhere in hopes of returning some amount for either the pensioners or the employees they're managing the money on behalf of, they invest in a bunch of funds, including the supply frame fund, right? So supply frame has a $100 million fund. Let's say they'll invest that in 25 total deals, which is pretty standard. So it's $4 million a deal. Really, the variance is pretty high because a lot of companies die early, and so it ends up being like 6 or 7 million per the deals that survive. A good venture fund, and not even great, a good venture fund will return 3 times money over the life of the fund, right? Now, the great funds, the Facebook first generation funds, have returned over 40x money, which is like an absurd multiple. But realistically, 3x fund is a good fund. And realistically, by the time after 7 years companies exit, the fund owns about 10% of the companies at that exit. And an exit is really any event that generates cash. So that can be an IPO, that can be a sale. And so with these simple numbers, real quick thing here, like the math we do is really easy. So don't ever let like a VC try to impress you with their fancy terms and stuff. We're literally doing like basic algebra. Like this is literally the math we do. Sorry? Yeah, so 7 years, funds last between 7 and 10 years. The average time for a company to exit successfully is around 7.5 years, and so that's to a sale or an IPO. So that's why I said 7 years. So after these exits, 10% of all the portfolio will generate positive value. So what that really means is that most of these companies will fail. 90% of these companies will fail. And in this case, a failure is not just a zero, but if you manage to return exactly what was invested in, that's a failure because you've waited 7 years and you haven't beat inflation and you've generated a lot of operational overhead, right? So within the scope of this, that qualifies as a failure. And really, you're down to about 3 companies having to return that $300 million, which really gets you to that number that everyone talks about, that unicorn number, $1 billion, right? So if you're wondering why everyone's so fixated on that unicorn value, that $1 billion value, like this is the kind of framework for why that $1 billion is important. And ultimately, like what drives a lot of the sometimes irrational decisions you see within the venture capital industry, right? Because the reality is good deals are supply constrained. There's a lot of venture capital floating around, and there's only so many great deals to be in. So I'll take specific questions at the end, but I promise you this will be the last slide that feels like a lecture. So when does VC money actually work? And specifically, when does it work if you're trying to start a hardware company? So if you're trying to build a fast-scaling hardware company, there's really a few models or loose frameworks that VCs are looking for, right? And the one that everyone knows or hears about is recurring revenue, right? So you sell the hardware, and this hardware is just an excuse to sell subscription services on top. So Nest and Ring both did a great job selling like pretty good but pretty commodity hardware and building a really good software experience on top and convincing people to pay month over month. Eventually not only covering the cost of the hardware, but generating like a pretty healthy software margin afterwards. The next is network effects, which is another buzzword that gets tossed around. Network effect just really means that every linear user growth generates kind of multiplicative value for both the users and the company. So Tile being a very literal and obvious one. If you're not familiar, Tile is this little device that uses Bluetooth Low Energy to kind of try and make a mesh network with other Tile users so you can find lost things. When they started, it was a little tenuous, but now they have density, and now they're doing tremendous amounts of revenue. Like, actually, that was a miss for Avdan and I, to be honest, because we were skeptical in the beginning, but they've really nailed the initial growth, and they have a strong network effect. Platform building. So DJI and Particle being great examples. If you can build a standard, like, that's awesome, right? Because standards are really sticky and hard to dislodge. That being said, it's really hard to kind of start with the intent of building a platform. We get pitched platforms all the time. There was a great XKCD joke many years back, which was, some guy's reading a spec sheet and says, I can't believe there's 12 standards for this. Like, I'm going to make a better standard. And then the last panel is a new spec sheet with 13 standards, right? So platform building is very difficult. Again, I would love to talk in more detail to anyone more interested at the end of the deck. And finally, the razor blade model is probably, if you're going to make pure hardware and only hardware, the razor blades model is the best shot at creating like a massive business, right? And that's where you are either subsidizing or taking low margin on a core piece of hardware, and then you're just selling really high margin consumables. Keurig being kind of the giant pure hardware play that uses the razor blade model. All right. So that was the part on venture. There's a great subreddit called OSHA, which I highly recommend everyone here check out. My father actually works for OSHA, and I sent to him, and he was not very amused. But regardless of people running side projects, people going out there and trying to build the next big platform, there's a few challenges that all hardware companies face, right? And in this next section, I won't have your answers, but hopefully I can arm you with the right questions to ask both yourself, your team, and your contractors as you start developing your product. And they're almost all around ramping up and the pains involved. The biggest that we see, especially among kind of the hacker and the maker crowd, is there's a lot of really good prototypers, a lot of people that do crazy, awesome, cool, strange stuff. And then they kind of take that and they throw it on Kickstarter, and then they kind of like, magic happens and you throw it to China, and then you end up with a product in the business, right? That is a really easy way to get yourself a lot of angry Kickstarter backers. The reality is prototyping, design for manufacturability, and the ability to work with contract manufacturers are all actually pretty discrete sets of skills. Right? Now there's the unique individuals that can do 2 or all of these, and if you find them, hang on to them because they're magical. But the reality is, like, yeah, this is kind of the life cycle of an iPad, right? Like, that was the original iPad prototype. And the person that could build that is very different than the person that could get that first case cut and made. It's very different than the person on the ground in Foxconn City, like, keeping this whole operation going. So when you're starting to build your product, really think through, obviously, once you're done prototyping, think through what it will take to get manufactured. Talk to the folks in this room. I'm looking around and I see people have done many steps of this, and really learn from people that have screwed up at these later stages. Minimum order quantities and contract manufacturers. The part that everyone knows is that the more you buy, the more you save, right? But the part also worth knowing is that different contract manufacturers actually specialize at different classes of quantity. And so what that means for you as you're building product is you kind of always want to be scouting and talking and bidding to other contract manufacturers, because the person that does 10 for you really well won't do 100 really well. The person that does 100 really well won't do 1,000 really well, right? And it kind of grows up in order of magnitude. Again, without getting into too much detail, all you need to take away from this point is that once you found your first CM, take a breath, have a beer, and then get right back to looking for more CMs. Domestic versus overseas. Another simple heuristic, stuff in the US gets turned around faster, they do a better job, it's a lot more expensive, right? And so when you're designing parts, so I see Sam, and he's working on a very interesting CNC'd wood part here, breaking down the costs, your cost in parts and your costs in labor and your costs in logistics, and being very disciplined on your BOM will help you make the right decision with domestic and overseas, right? It's really easy to kind of just look at a list of parts and say, oh, like, you know, how many cents for each? That's easy. Like, let me just send this to someone in Shenzhen and call it a day. Like, really, really break down and be disciplined about all pieces of the process, not just the parts. Count the labor, count logistics. Like, I used to ship 40-pound bicycle cases, and like, God, it took us so long to like figure out the right way to just optimize a simple thing like packing a bike, and whether that should be done domestically, what parts should be done overseas, where people should tie things, where people should cut things. And then ultimately, like, when to raise money, so equity versus debt, right? Another rule of thumb, if you can finance with debt, right? Equity is really expensive. You're selling a pound of flesh, especially early on for inventory. Like, you're gonna kick yourself later on if you're selling equity. Now, the chicken and egg problem, which I'm sure many of you experience, is that debt is hard to get early on, right? Suppliers, my supplier's gonna hate me for telling you this, so hopefully we keep this in this room, but suppliers are generally, if you can convince them that, damn it. So there's a camera out there. If you can convince your supplier that you're trustworthy, and you can convince them that you're going to succeed, especially the smaller suppliers will often extend terms of debt. If not the first run, then the second run. And I'm not going to talk about the details of negotiating here. If you're interested, we can talk after this. But there's the magic in a good hardware company is as much managing cash flow as it is designing a great product. And I can't emphasize that enough, right? And in fact, you could probably get away with a crappier product that kind of works and really good cash flow management than an awesome product and terrible cash flow management, right? Like, Juicero is a beautifully designed product. The engineers there were probably like some of the best mechanical engineers in San Francisco, and yet like they're really bad at managing cash flow. I gotta stop saying specific companies while I'm on camera. And I'm sure you've all seen kind of the troubles they're facing now. And so that's really all I had. Again, I don't come with specific answers because your product and your process and your team will dictate a lot of specifics. But hopefully you now understand a little bit more of the nuance in building not just great hardware, but good hardware companies. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has.
You mentioned like taking debt or equity. How do you go about that?
Sorry.
Like, how does a small company or a new company issue debt?
Yeah. Okay. So the question is like debt versus equity. How does a small company? The question: how does a small company raise debt or? Got it. So actually, Kickstarter is a form of debt. Like, that's, and to be very clear, like, if you're going on Kickstarter, that is debt. That's a liability on your balance sheet, right? It happens to be interest-free, minus like the Kickstarter fee, but like Kickstarter is a form of debt. For very small companies, it's hard for me to recommend in like good conscience that you collateralize your own personal assets, but that is an option, right? And so I don't recommend that, but that is a way to raise an immediate initial debt. The other one is, again, finding a supplier that you can work with and that you work well with, that you can convince, hopefully, truthfully, that you'll be successful and that they should trust you. A lot of the smaller suppliers will extend some form of credit or debt for inventory runs, right? So when I was running this bicycle company, one of our main competitors, their big advantage was they had found a random new small company in China and like convinced them to work with them on great terms for debt, and like they had a huge advantage with cash flow management versus us. But that involves like not just the like Alibaba chat, but if you're gonna get serious, like visiting, kind of walking, like sending gifts to them, like using WeChat instead of Gmail, right? Like just kind of making it easier for them to do business. They'll want to make it easier for you to do business. Right?
Does that include doing like trying to get stressed net payments and stuff, like 120?
Yeah. Yeah. So net 120 basically means like you owe the balance of your inventory 120 days after receiving or after shipping, depending on the terms. But you'll hear terms tossed around like net 30, net 60, net 120. Basically means like you have to settle your balances that many days after either they ship or after you receive, depending on the terms. But I mean, the entire supply chain operates on a lot of debt once you start doing any sort of volume. And so the suppliers understand and are pretty sophisticated about issuing debt.
Are there tricks not tricks, but are there like tips for asking for that kind of thing or no?
The tip is you just have to endear yourself to them. I mean, I wish there was like a play-by-play thing to follow, but a lot of it is like sleuthing, right? Like depending on what you're making, most industries usually have trade shows once or twice a year. Like figure out the big trade show, go to the big trade show for your industry, meet all the trade shows I've been to, the like top floor and the back corners are like where all the small CMs are, and they're usually hanging out and like eating their lunch and like not really doing much else. And like if you just go up and engage them, you'll get a lot of no's, but if you find like one yes and one person willing to work with you, that's a start. Yeah.
The figure of 10% success rate on startups, or more accurately, 90% failing rate, seems to be so consistent over so many years. Why has that always been so consistent?
Yeah. So the business of venture is to look for high return, high risk companies. Right, like if you want to return 7% annualized, there's Vanguard's like a multi-trillion-dollar fund that can do that consistently. But venture is a small asset class that really looks for big companies that have pretty binary outcomes where they either hit it big or they kind of just peter out. Right, it's like playing baseball and only try to swing for home runs. It's not a great dominant strategy for the entire market, but like a small subset of folks can pull it off, and venture is kind of like the class of private equity that makes those attempts. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Does the talent to identify a successful potential startup get better as you go along?
I would hope so. Yeah, we'll find out. So there's a lot of factors at play, and kind of like RF is the black magic in EE world. Within investing VCs, a little bit of black magic as well. The really dominant tier one funds have momentum because they have their pick of deals, right? If you're a really solid entrepreneur, like if you're running some team at any of the big 4 or 5 hardware, software or hardware companies, there's a few funds that you want to go to, right? And so they get great deal flow, and so they get better deals, and they become better funds, and like that's kind of once you get to that stage, you kind of have a dominance. What Root is we're something called a micro VC, where we can't compete with those tier one funds for those deals, but that's not our strategy. We believe that we can be dominant in a niche that is underexploited by large tier one funds because there hasn't traditionally been as much focus. And for us, that's hardware and industrial automation. All right. That was long-winded as well. Hopefully that was a bit more clarifying. Yeah.
Did you raise funding for your bicycle company?
Yes.
And then, so if you did you start the company with the intention of raising funds later on, or did you start it as a prototype, as a hardware that you wanted to build, and then it blossomed into something that you decided to raise funding for?
Right. So we went out trying to build a large bicycle company. So we went out with the willingness to give up all of this. Mostly because I either wanted this to succeed wildly or I want to fail quickly and then I can move on. Now it kind of ended up middling where ultimately like it was stable but not very fast, and so we found a competitor that wanted to take it over and grow the economy of scale a little bit. So the brand still exists. It's just behind the scenes. It's all kind of run under the same few companies, but we raised a little bit of equity from friends and family, and also debt through our suppliers. So, yes.
I was waffling on whether to ask it or not, but you said it.
Yeah.
Is the mantra of fail fast perpetuated by VCs to get onto their next deal? Is it in their benefit?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Failing fast is in the benefit of the VCs, definitely, because companies that are failing generate operational overhead for management, for investors, for legal teams, and if failing fast is always preferable. Now, whether that's good for the entrepreneur or not kind of depends on the situation, right? It's complicated. As an entrepreneur, it's not great to spend 4 years trying to like save a company that's kind of falling apart. But at the same time, there are definitely situations where incentives might be orthogonal, and that's very case specific. But I will say that good investors will always be aligned with the entrepreneurs because from their perspective, the reputational risk is not worth the whatever minuscule percentage of the fund they'd recover by kind of making the process painful.
VCs can be more than just money. They give you things like management experience,
Yes.
and connections. What other kinds of things do VCs give you?
Yep. So that's a good question. The question is, VCs are more than just money. What else do VCs provide? It depends on the fund, right? So some funds specialize in management, and so actually, if you look at called the tier one funds, like their expertise and their gravitas allows them to recruit excellent management. Oftentimes, the partners there have been managers of massive companies themselves. For us specifically, going back to this, both Avadon and I come from software engineering backgrounds. He was embedded systems, I was in wireless networking. And a lot of times we do, I know for a fact that Avadon did code and algorithm reviews with Shaper when it was still a thesis. And then I did some code review with anthropology. So specifics aside, we're focused on technical expertise. I don't claim that Avadon or I are experts on a lot of this stuff, but what we have is a strong portfolio of founders who at different stages have faced a lot of problems and challenges, and then new companies in our portfolio kind of learn from that institutional memory. I can tell you that Particle is probably one of the largest purchasers of a specific Broadcom module, and if you ever have any bug with that module, they know the answer to that in a heartbeat. So for us, keeping the fund focused allows us to kind of spread expertise around.
How did you go from being an entrepreneur to being a VC?
Yeah.
What do you think of that transition?
Yeah, so I actually started in software engineering, and when I wanted to move to New York City, because all my friends were in New York City, at the time, the big tech companies hadn't opened their engineering offices there yet, and so the engineering options were really in quant hedge funds, which I wasn't super interested in, and a few venture funds which are willing to hire technical people to do investing in technical companies. So that was more, I just happened to be in the right time and the right place for that. In terms of, I think the second part of your question was like how do I, what's my feedback? Yeah, listen, if you guys are all hackers, it sucks to not be able to ship product and work on like tactical projects where you're really kind of gunning for a deadline and you're doing really cool stuff and finding really cool like crazy out of left field hacks to like make something work. That part you miss in venture. Literally, the joke is that VCs produce emails and meetings. Like that's our product. So coming from engineering, that is something that you'll miss. On the plus side, you get to see a lot of really cool stuff that people are working on, right? Like, I have really short attention span, and being able to see like what all these companies are working on is an incredible experience. Okay, great. Thanks for coming.